All right, grade 7. So we're moving into a new unit now. We're going to be looking at term three's work. By now you've already learnt about the transatlantic slave trade taking place on the western side of Africa, where many men were captured and then shipped across the Atlantic Ocean towards the Americas and Europe. All right, and now we're going to be looking a bit more south, and we're going to be focusing on Dutch settlement in South Africa. But before we get to that, we need to revise a bit of grade 5's work. So we're going to look at the indigenous inhabitants of Southern Africa, the first African farmers, just to refresh your memory, and this is all in your textbook as well to help you. So pretty much when we look at Southern Africa, we firstly look at the indigenous inhabitants of the Cape in the 17th century. So I hope you haven't forgotten, but the 17th century being the 1600s. Remember when we learnt about Mansa Musa and the Kingdom of Mali? This is when we learnt about how centuries work. So that 100 years needs to be made up before it's considered a century. All right, so when we look at Southern Africa, again, we speak about indigenous inhabitants. So indigenous, you should remember that indigenous means originally to a specific place. Okay, so an indigenous plant means that originally comes from that area. So like we have a lot of jacaranda trees in Southern Africa, they are referred to as an alien species because it is not indigenous to South Africa, it's indigenous to Australia. So therefore we know that that is an Australian plant. Okay, so indigenous people of Southern Africa, we do know that this was the Khoisan. Okay, and it's not to be confused. So there was a bit of a difference between the Khoi and the San. Okay, but they are commonly referred to as the same as the Khoisan. Pretty much the San were hunter-gatherers. They were nomadic, so they'd continuously move around, looking and hunting for food as well as gathering food. They were very simplistic, so they lived a very simple life. They'd never eat or consume too much. They just would take what they needed, especially from the land, to ensure that the plants, etc., would grow back, and there was more than enough for the wildlife, etc., to live off. So it was pretty much that constant circle of life that they maintained. There was no such thing as greed, etc., where people wanted to occupy land. They just used and utilized the land as best they could in order to survive. The Khoi, very similar, but a few differences. So the San would make little thatch huts to live in because they knew that they weren't going to be living there long. They'd obviously keep on moving around. Whereas the Khoi were a little bit different, as they were the first herders. So the Khoi realized it was a bit easier to rather keep cattle or sheep, because now you don't have to physically go and hunt all the time. You do have a constant source of food. But on the other side of the coin, you had to care for these animals. And this will tie into the first African farmer. So if you look on page 100 and 101 of your textbook, you'll read about the San and the hunter-gatherers. There's a nice picture there that summarizes everything for you. And then the Khoi herders, where there's a few points on them where they talk about how they kept herds and cattle of sheep and did not plant and grow food. Right, they hunted animals and caught fish and gathered roots, etc. So very similar to the San, but there are a few differences. It's important to know those differences. All right, then we're going to talk about the first African farmers. So again, looking back at this map, what we do know is the first African farmers came from northern Africa or northern parts of Africa. Because the land became infertile, they had to start looking for better land to farm on, and they made their way down south, and they were met by the Khoisan when they arrived in southern Africa. Okay, so this is before Dutch settlement. When they arrived here, they were met with the Khoisan. They respected the Khoisan as the first inhabitants of the land. There was no fighting, etc. They actually had a high respect for the Khoisan and thought that they had magical powers. Because if you remember in grade 5, you would have learned how the San beliefs, they would go into trance and believe they were a certain animal. And they would do things like rain dancing and so on, and they would bring upon the rain. So, as I said, the first African farmers, they thought they had some sort of magical powers, and they really respected them, but all they were looking for was a place to farm, and that's when you would see things like this. Okay, so this is an example of how the first African farmers settled, and again, this will be on page 101 of your textbook, but this is an example of a homestead. All right, so what makes up a homestead? You pretty much have a kraal. This is where the animals would be looked after. All right, you have your huts that go around the kraal, and that's referred to as a homestead. This would belong to one family. Okay, so there'd maybe be a husband, and he'd have more than one wife, and all his wives and kids, etc., would live in that homestead. Many homesteads put together would make a village. Right, and village were clan specific. So what I mean by clan specific, it would belong to a certain culture. All right, so if you had a Zulu homestead or village, it would just be many Zulu families that live in that specific area, all right, and over there they'd have a chief. So you've all heard about Shaka Zulu, so he was the leader, but each homestead would have a representative or elder. These people would vote in a chief, and the chief would make the decisions about how to share the land equally, make sure that everyone has equal resources, etc., and that everyone is happy, and they could be voted out, and so on. All right, so that's pretty much how the first African farmers settled. Page number 102 just elaborates on that. There's a few points that you can read through, and then you need to be moving on to activity 1. All right, activity 1, as I say, is just revision work. Use your textbook. All the answers are there. You have to answer question 1 to 5, and the 5th question being completing the table. All right, grade 7. So by next week, for history, we'll be moving on to the colonization of Southern Africa and Dutch settlement. So when we talk about colonization, that is a colony that will come in and use the land resources and so on. We'll talk a bit more in depth about it. As I've said to you in previous geography lessons, we spoke about how the English colonized many parts of Africa and parts of the world. And this is what we're going to be looking at when we start with page number 104 and we look at Dutch settlement and exactly how everything came about. Okay, so grade 7s, you just have activity 1 for history this week. You just keep up the hard work. And for those of you working at home, keep your heads down. If you have any questions, feel free to email me, and I'll answer you as soon as I can.